about the implications of all of this. We can talk more about the possible outcome of the intervention in Libya. With me in the studio, Shashank Joshi, Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you very much for coming in to talk to us. We were hearing actually in our report just a moment ago from the director of the Royal United Services Institute saying that talk about what happens after the military intervention is actually something to do with what the Arab League should do. He's saying it's not going to be the coalition's problem after this military operation's over. What would you say about that?
Well, first of all, the objective of this is not a legal issue. It's a political choice. The UN resolution itself is very broad. It says all necessary means may be used to protect civilians under the threat of attack. And if it's so judged that the threat comes from the regime itself, from Colonel Gaddafi himself, regime change could be justified within the terms of that resolution. Although many would argue it's a tenuous point, it would be stretching the point.
But you're clear it would be legal?
Well, I'm not an international lawyer, but I can see how one could argue it would be legal within the scope of that resolution. But here's a scenario. The no-fly zone is being implemented very fast and effectively, and it will be in place, if not now, then very soon indeed. But once it's imposed, and we freeze the situation, with some of Colonel Gaddafi's armour destroyed, his aeroplanes grounded, but some armour still in the northeast, some of it still inside cities, some of his infantry inside cities where they can't be hit. What happens then? If that no-fly zone is withdrawn, we may see a return to the situation of a couple of weeks ago. Because the rebels, of course, are not arming themselves in any meaningful way. They have no way of acquiring the same artillery, the same tanks as Colonel Gaddafi. So are we going to sustain a no-fly zone indefinitely? In Iraq it lasted for 12 years, of course. Or are we going to pull out and risk a repeat of the same conditions that generated this resolution in the first place? And I would argue the Arab League is not going to step in. The Arab League has already shown it has little appetite for stepping into this. It was pushed into this, it did support a no-fly zone, but already its support is melting away.
But it was calling for a no-fly zone, wasn't it?
It certainly did, and Amma Musa, its Secretary-General, only yesterday said, well, a no-fly zone, we didn't mean this. But he knew perfectly well what it was, so I would suggest the Arab League, Amma Musa, and its constituent states all have their own domestic political incentives not to support a Western-backed campaign in Libya in this way. But that does mean who's going to take up the slack when this goes on for weeks and weeks. Qatar is a welcome contribution, but it's a tiny Arab state, not representative of full Arab opinion. It's not going to be the bedrock of this campaign.
So do you believe, then, that this will result in a stalemate? I mean, is there any way that the opposition forces could come and deal a knockout blow to Gaddafi after?
It seems unlikely. They could certainly push westwards. They could certainly push back to some of those strategic oil towns you remember they took, just a week and a half ago. That's possible. And in doing so, they may seize back some of the oil export revenue that's flowing to Gaddafi right now. But Gaddafi is hundreds of miles to the west, in a fortified city where his support is not exactly ebbing away fast, and he retains the loyalty of thousands of security forces. So militarily speaking, why do we think he's going to collapse suddenly?
Do you think it was right for the no-fly zone to be enforced in the first place, for this action to have begun?
Yes, I think it was. I think it was done in a very legal way, a procedurally proper way. It had broad-based support from a historic coalition. What's damaging has been the implementation. That has been implemented without any sense of what the political objective is, and so there is no end game in sight. There was not sufficient effort made to bind Arab states into this process from the beginning.
Right, I mean, what we're being told is the objective is to protect civilians, to stop the massacre that seemed to be imminent on Benghazi, and then leave it to the Libyan people to decide their future.
Well, those two things could be in contradiction. The moment you leave it to the Libyans, you simply revert to the situation of a powerful armed regime versus partially armed but insufficiently organised rebels in one corner of the country. So yes, the rebels may be arming themselves via Egypt. Yes, we've destroyed some of Gaddafi's armours. We've destroyed some of his aircraft, his helicopters. He still retains a preponderance of force. So what is to say that the situation will not simply lapse into another assault on civilians again?
I guess there's a psychological element as well, in that possibly some of Gaddafi's supporters might decide to turn against him when they see the full might of the operation against them. Is there any evidence of that at all?
Well, there's no evidence so far. There's a hope that occurs, but it's a gamble. There is a hope that if you combine this military pressure with political pressure, travel bans, asset freezes, tighten the flow of money coming into Gaddafi's regime, you may turn over a few people in his regime, you may turn over many in Tripoli itself. But that is a gamble. There's no reason to think that's happening now at anything like a pace that would allow this to conclude within days.
Shashank Joshi, thank you.